All right, well, let's kick things off. Thank you for joining us. This is the Exit Advisors Town Hall Series, and today's topic is why most businesses never sell. And it's going to be featured by Al Danto. Al is the managing partner of our firm, Exit Advisors, one of the managing partners, and is also faculty at Rice. Very, very well versed in the uh, language of M&A and all the nuances to it. And Al's accompanied today by various experts within different fields. We've got Greg Phillips, Phillips Kaiser, and he's representing the legal arm. We've got Gary Cooper, the other managing partner of Exit Advisors, and also the president and CEO of Cooper CPA Group. He's going to be approaching this from the financial and accounting perspective. Al Galindo, he's actually a buyer, so Al will be looking at this from the perspective of a potential purchaser. Shelley Ewer of Comerica Bank, and she's going to be looking at this from the perspective of the financing and banking arm. And finally, Peggy Tate, who's a certified business broker and intermediary who operates in a similar fashion to us for smaller businesses. So most of you are aware Exit Advisors is a lower middle market M&A firm. And I'm going to kick things off a little bit differently today with some pretty profound statistics. Al's going to elaborate on these, but I just want to set the tone. So when we talk about the lower middle market and kind of our wheelhouse, it's a pretty big wheelhouse. So it's businesses that are in the 50 million range or less in terms of revenues. And that market consists of 90% of all businesses globally, not just in the US. 90% of businesses are in the lower middle market. And some stats that are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and also from other sources are 20% of all these businesses fail within the first year, 30% within the second year, meaning by the second to the fifth year, 50% of all businesses have failed. And then that number by the end of a decade reaches 70%. 70%. That means 30% of any businesses that were started are only 30% exist after a decade. So now that an owner and an operator has hurdled that and they've gotten to that point, then they have to go through an M&A. They have to go through a transaction unless they just want to dissolve their business. And the failure rate on M&A transactions, according to a lot of different sources, is somewhere in the percentile of 70 to 90. So 70 to 90% of those businesses that have hurdled all of those challenges throughout those years are now going to fail at the 11th hour. Al's going to focus on why those businesses are failing and hopefully what you can do to avoid that. But that's where we come into play. That's where Exit Advisors really brings the value, because we want to flip those statistics on their head and guide all these companies through a successful transaction. So Al, I'm going to pass it off to you. You can kick things off, but final note for everybody, we're going to have Q&A at the end. I've already had a slew of questions submitted beforehand, so if you have additional ones, we've got the Q&A feature at the bottom, and look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks, Andrew. As an entrepreneur, lifelong entrepreneur, I hate to talk about negative stuff. I'm usually the glass is 90% full, 10% empty. But this is an interesting topic. And I was asked a couple of years ago, someone asked me, said, what percent of businesses actually sell that start? And I said, I really don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I researched a little bit and was really surprised, like Andrew said, that at the end of this really difficult journey, that even businesses that go to market, only a small percent of them actually sell. So, the dream to start a business, grow the business, sell the business, and retire, it's tough. It's a really challenging journey. So we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to get through this real quickly, just on a little bit of the stats and kind of general framework for what you can do. But I'm really excited to have and share these different perspectives because each one's a little bit unique and different, and you have to manage this as you go through the process. So As Andrew said, Greg Phillips, who is a great transaction attorney. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of having a transaction attorney that shares that experience. We're going to talk about the challenges from the legal standpoint. Gary Cooper from a financial accounting due diligence. Al Galindo, he's going to go through. I was trying to calculate how many business owners Al talked to in his 2-year journey to buy a business, how many looked at, but certainly in the hundreds. But the perspective of the buyer, what does the buyer look for? Shelley Ewart from Comerica Bank is a lender. She's been an SBA and commercial lender, understands the banking role in getting a transaction across the finish line. And Peggy Tate, an intermediary, very professional intermediary, business broker from Certified Business Brokers. So we're going to get their perspectives and pull all that together, so you can see how challenging the process is, and how these various stakeholders really play into it. So if we can go to the next slide, Mari. Entrepreneurship is a challenging journey. Just to start and get going and survive is incredibly challenging. Stats, vary, but certainly the vast majority of all small businesses that start don't really make it. Half, 50 to 60% fail within the first 5 years, and 70% within the first 10 years. It's a challenging journey, a challenging process. And when you get through that and get to the finish line, and you start to look to sell, go on the next slide, Mari. It's even more challenging. So to think that this pot of gold is just waiting out there at the end of the journey, it's not always true. It really isn't. Less than 20% that go on the market ever sell. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then those that sell, go to the next slide. Really, there's a wide range of valuations. We've talked a lot about that in previous town halls. Several of our partners at Exit Advisors are certified valuation analysts, so we understand the valuation of small businesses. But even within the same industry and the same size companies, there is a wide range of valuations, from companies that may sell for even a fraction, percentage of their multiple of earnings, to those that sell for several times their earnings. A lot of factors go into that. We have a lot of educational materials. Go next slide, Mari. To really understand what drives value and marketability. So, at the end of the day, I just encourage everybody out there to understand what drives valuation, what drives marketability, what makes a company stand out, and be able to, at the end of the day, not only sell, but command in the marketplace a high valuation. Our next town hall, we're going to feature Dave Linda. Dave has probably had the highest relative valuation for a project-based company that I've ever seen or have been a part of. He just did everything right. He eliminated most all the standard risks, the common risks in a small business. He had impeccable financials, great reputation. And when we went to market, helped him go to market, he commanded a premium. I mean, we had multiple buyers that were out there lined up. He had an all-cash offer that was above his list price. So today we're going to talk about the challenges and why businesses don't sell. But our next town hall, we'll talk about kind of the anatomy of a really successful sale and why Dave was able to do that. But there's plenty of resources out there. We have them on our website. I wrote a book called, an ebook called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Understanding Business Valuation, tons of internet resources. So I just really want to emphasize to go out there and understand this process, right? So you know what you get. And here are some common reasons why businesses don't sell. We'll talk about those with our experts today, but just unrealistic expectations, limited free cash flow, unverifiable free cash flow, inconsistent revenues and income. In today's world, you can't hide a poor online reputation, poor Yelp reviews, poor Google reviews. These really impact and hurt valuation. Excessive owner involvement. You'll hear a lot about that today. And then some companies just can't get through this due diligence process. It's an incredibly challenging process that you're going to go through, from the buyer, the buyer's team, the financing, equity investors, the banks. They really want to understand every aspect of the business and getting through due diligence. Some geographic locations just aren't desirable, but there's many, many other reasons why businesses don't sell, and I really want to try to cover them today and summarize them. No particular order here, but again, we just want this to make a good free-flowing discussion from these stakeholders that really have a say in, is the business going to get through and be able to be sold? We're going to have a successful transaction or not? A lot of experience. Greg, let's start with you. As an attorney, I know you came out of Compact. You're one of Compact's first attorneys, help with all their transactions, protecting their protecting their IP. You've been a transaction attorney. So what do you see out there, Greg? What are some of the challenges in getting a transaction across the finish line from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, no, thanks, Alan. Thanks for letting me be a part of the panel today. From my perspective, I am very involved in the small to middle market space. And one of the things you had it on your slide, one of your previous slides, is just unrealistic expectations from sellers. The M&A process, selling your business, it is a process. And I think a lot of sellers get overwhelmed with the process. And you mentioned due diligence. I mean, it is a probing exercise where you have to think a lot of the buyers, they have private equity money backing them, or sometimes, and Shelley can talk about the banks as they get involved. It is a very detailed process to go through due diligence. And I think a lot of sellers really get shocked just the way that the process is undertaken. The other thing is just the deal documentation. Going through, whether it's a stock purchase or an asset purchase, the seller really has to understand what each and every word in those documents say, especially when it comes to reps and warranties. The seller is making representations and warranties as to the status of the business. And sometimes it's really difficult for the seller to sit down and take the time to read the documents and understand them. On a typical deal, I'll take a full day in walking through the reps and warranties slowly to make sure the seller really understands what they're repping to when it comes to a deal. So the whole process can be overwhelming, and I think it breaks down. And that's one of the reasons a lot of these deals don't go through, because the process becomes overwhelming for the seller.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the reps and warranties, what that is?
Yeah, and typically, and it's pretty standard language. You'll have, let's say, an asset sale. You'll have an asset sale where there's a representation that the seller is going to make that, look, there's been no litigation in the last 3 years, right? Or if there has been, you need to disclose it on a disclosure schedule, or that, all taxes have been paid, or if there are any issues, you disclose it on a disclosure schedule. Listing of employees, and there are no benefits, or, list the benefit plans and packages on a disclosure schedule. All permits for the business are there. And otherwise, if they're not, you got to disclose, anything that may be an issue. And so there are many reps, and it comes to if companies are making widgets, right? You have to make a rep that there have been no hazardous materials used in the business, or there have been no problems with environmental laws. If there have, you have to disclose it on a disclosure schedule. So, there's a long list of reps about the accuracy of the information provided to the seller, about the business and how the business has been run over, the past 3 to 5 years. And basically what the seller is trying to do is basically trying to get the buyer to disclose any gotchas, any surprises. There's nothing wrong with saying, look, this business hasn't been perfect in the last 3 to 5 years. Here's some issues, put them on a disclosure schedule. But the issue, Al, is that it takes a lot of work to walk through each rep, and the seller has to really think through, the business status over the past 3 to 5 years and determine what to disclose or not to disclose. I tell a lot of my clients that really you can, everything else in the document, you probably won't see a problem arise after the deal is closed. But the one area where a seller can really get into trouble is in the reps and warranties, because if things don't go as planned, that's where the buyer will pull out that piece of the agreement, the reps and warranties, and try to claw back issues because the deal didn't work out. So that's very important in the document.
And you know, Greg, one of the things that we try to do, our mission kind of at Exit Advisors is to prepare ahead of time, right? So they don't get caught by these surprises at the end. So what can a business owner do ahead of time? So when they get into the final contracts and due diligence and everything, these just don't pop up and kind of kill a deal, right? So we had a deal one time that happened where the seller's contracts weren't assignable. So a part of due diligence said that before we close on the transaction, we want to make sure that these clients sign over and are okay with us. And they were like the big competitor that those didn't want to deal with. And he said, I don't want to do that before we close. And they said, well, we don't want to close until we're sure that we have these contracts. And just the fact that they didn't have an assignability clause in those contracts, right, really shot down the whole deal.
Yeah, Al, it's a good question. Number one, I think every company, as you're starting to grow and you find yourself getting these calls of potential suitors, you definitely need to wrap yourself with good advisors, good consultants. Just being honest, Al, what you guys do, Exit Advisors, that's the perfect resource to help you as a business owner prepare for the exit someday. Just having the proper consultants will help you prepare. The other thing I think owners can do, or potential sellers can do, is step back and think about your business. There is no such thing as a perfect business. Every business is going to have some hiccups. Think about the things in your business that you know yourself that may be either warts or may be problematic, and just be prepared to disclose those to the buyer. Right? Just be open and honest, put things on the table, and you'll have to work through those with the buyer, whether you're going to work through the issues and figure out a fix. It may affect the purchase price, but the worst thing you can do is try to sweep anything under the rug, because it's going to come out one way or another in the due diligence process. So you may as well just be open and upfront at the beginning, because you can wrap it into the deal structure and get beyond it early on, versus trying to hide it and it becomes a surprise to everyone on the back end and the deal blows.
Greg, if I might add something, in the transaction that we did last year, so at the beginning of the transaction, the sellers did not have an M&A lawyer, and they were really scared about the reps and warranties. But once they got an M&A lawyer, they actually saw it the other way. They saw it as a protection to them, because as long as they disclose what they need to disclose, then that's what they are held to, right? And so they saw that eventually as a protection for them as well, right?
Al, that's exactly right. The point is, and I tell clients, be open and honest, and all you have to do is disclose, right? It doesn't mean the deal is going to crater or terminate. The more upfront you are with the potential buyer, it's probably going to help get your deal closed. The trust factor is built, and it will be a plus in the deal. So the whole point is just disclose, to not try to hide anything, no matter how bad it is. I agree.
Yeah, I agree, Greg. That's one of the biggest things we see. And we tell that, due diligence is going to uncover every wart, right? And like you said, no business is perfect. But if you go into it and if you hid that from your advisors, you hid that from the buyer, it's going to come out eventually. And if it doesn't, and you're asked, it can be misrepresentation, right?
Right. That's a potential lawsuit, and that's the worst thing you could have.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Al, let's hop over to you on this. So you looked at, I think you've talked to, what did we figure this morning? Several hundred business owners. You got to a letter of intent on 5 deals, and you closed on 1. So, share your experiences as you're going through, and you looked at a lot of deals and didn't move forward on those deals. So maybe if you could focus a again, the topic of today's conversation is why businesses don't sell. So what did you see when you were out there, why these businesses didn't sell to you? I mean, a sophisticated buyer with capital and lined up, right? So you were out there looking to acquire a company.
Yeah. So the number one reason why we dropped leads was because the valuation expectation was there was a discrepancy between valuation that we thought that the business that we could pay for and what the seller was expecting, and so that's one. The second one, probably tied for first place, because we were doing a proprietary search. So basically, we were doing outreach to business owners who were not on the market. And so the other reason is when sellers were considering to sell, but were not sold on the idea of selling. And so I think how I can tie this to what can a seller do to improve the chances of closing a transaction is because of how many business owners we talk to, the mindset from the buyer's point of view, when right from the first call, it's to get as soon as we can to the point where we know, is there intent to sell and are we in line with valuation? And so there are things that a seller, there are signs that will show that a seller is serious. And so there's situation in life as well. So what I will do as a seller, it's if I'm serious about selling, I will make that clear and say, why is it that I want to sell now, right? And so that goes a long way, because then those are the opportunities that we focus on, most of our effort when we see that there's likelihood of the seller actually wanting to sell, right?
So then you got to letter of intent on 5 companies, is that right? So that means you got into
Yes.
due diligence with 5 companies. And why didn't they go through? What came up in your due diligence?
2 of them was the financials were not, there were some accounting methods that were not compliant with, GAAP compliant, right? And so once we looked in with detail at the details, then we found that the specifically the calculation of EBITDA was off. And so the problem with that is there's it's always going to be off, but it was off by a lot, right? And so then it was impossible to reset expectations, right? So we found that EBITDA was really about a half of what was assumed at the beginning, and a third of what was assumed in the other one. So it was a huge discrepancy, and so it was impossible to reset expectations at that point. So that was 2 of those. One of them closed, and then the other 2. One of them, the seller decided not to continue. So it was the intent of selling. He was undecided. And then the other one, we found that the industry, it had to do with, which is also something that I found to be also a success factor, which is a communication factor. There's a lot of terms that can be used interchangeably that changes the entire economic valuation. So for example, if a buyer tells me that they have 50% recurring revenue, but it's not recurring, it's repeat, then that's very different, and the valuation is very different. And so that happened in the other one, where it really wasn't recurring, and so that completely changes the valuation. So that happened in the other one, and so those are those 5 LOIs.
Good, great, incredible process you went through. With that, Shelley, let's come back to you. So you're you finance these transactions, right? I guess at the end of the day, you're the one who decides if the money's going to go forward or not, right? So what do you see, and what stops it from a banking perspective?
Yeah, so I just want to elaborate a little bit more on some great points that Al Galindo made, which was, there were some themes. I think 2 of his LOIs really came back to that value that fell through. It came back to the valuation. Even it was the reoccurring revenue instance, or the EBITDA adjustment, right? And so one thing to keep in mind just in regards to valuation too, is that the bank is also relying on those valuations. And if the buyer is coming to the table with SBA financing, the SBA is not going to allow a buyer to pay more than what that valuation comes back at. There is a little wiggle room, so typically we can go, we can, if it makes sense, we can go 10% above that valuation as far as financing goes, but otherwise the deal will be dead in the water. So it's really, really important to be talking to your advisors and preparing for that valuation and making sure that your expectations are realistic and your business is prepared from a numbers perspective to look as good as it can when you're getting that valuation done. Another thing that Al mentioned, Al Danto mentioned, was, the owner being too involved in the business. One thing we really look at is, what is the business when the owner steps away? And if there is no business left when the owner steps away, if the owner is really the one that has all of those relationships, then it's going to be a really hard deal for us to finance and get behind. Other things that we look at, something that's important, has caused some of the transactions that I've seen fall through, is making sure the owner needs to make sure that all of their stakeholders are on board. So in particular, if you have a partner, you and your partner need to be on the same page. And it can be very difficult to finance a transaction if the partner, one partner wants to exit and another partner wants to stay on. And the reason why that can be so difficult to finance is because typically when we're financing an acquisition, the assets of the company are being leveraged, right, for the loan. Well, how do you do that? You can't leverage 50% of the assets. It just doesn't work that way. And so if you have a partner involved, where is that financing going to come from? What is going to be the collateral of that loan if the other partner isn't willing to have the business that they have 50% ownership in, have filings against those assets? So that can be very tricky. And as we're talking about stakeholders too, I have seen, unfortunately, some transactions that have fallen through because maybe the owner was ready to sell, but maybe the owner's spouse was not on board. Whether that spouse had ownership or not, of course, they have a say in timing. And so make sure that, your loved ones support the decision that you're going to make and keep them informed along the way. I actually had a transaction that fell through pretty much at the closing table because the spouse found out a detail of the transaction that she was not okay with. And so that transaction that we spent, almost a year on, got canceled right there, pretty much at the closing table. And the last thing that I just would like to mention that can make it really difficult for a transaction is if a seller is not willing to do a seller's note. Obviously, sellers out there, they'd like to be able to walk away with 100% cash. But, from a buyer perspective and from a bank perspective, it is very important to have a seller's note so that the seller can kind of have skin in the game and make us feel comfortable that they're going to be there if their issues do arise along the way. And that seller's note, it can be for just a couple of years, but something so that there's still some skin in the game and the bank can feel comfortable that you're going to be there as a resource as the owner inevitably is going to need some help and counseling.
Yeah, great point, Shannon. To go a little bit deeper on the partners deal, what we see a lot in the real world are partners that get into the transaction, but they don't agree on terms, value, valuation, and everything. And it makes it really hard, especially when you start to get into multiple partners, right? And I know Greg could add from a legal standpoint on, minority, shareholder misrepresentation and stuff like that. If you kind of, so, in that case, your operating agreement is critical in how these decisions are going to be made. It inevitably, it's not just the valuation, but it's the terms, right? Like you said, the seller note, the ongoing, maybe an earnout, right? And we see a lot of discrepancies with partners. It gets real challenging, right, at that standpoint.
To piggyback on that, and also back to the first point that Shelley made about the bank involvement in the valuation part of it. One thing that was a key success factor for us is that even before I put the IOI, the preliminary offer, I was engaged with the bank from that point, and so that was a key success factor. Without that, I would have structured it differently, probably in a way that we wouldn't have met our covenants in the end, and so that was key. And also it was a good check, because they even gave me their own model, and so it was a good independent check to my model, filling out their model. So that was key for us.
Hey, Shelley, can I ask a quick question on the seller's note?
Sure.
In some cases, there's interest only. Some cases, payments can't be made until a certain period of time, and then some principal and interest. Does that have to do with the risk of the transaction, or what creates that?
Sure. So if the deal is being financed with an SBA loan, there can be some nuances depending on how much cash the buyer is coming to the table with. So if the buyer is trying to come to the table with the minimum amount, then we will potentially some of the seller's note will have to be fully subordinated. The more cash that the buyer comes to the table with, obviously, the less strict we're going to be on what that seller's note looks like as far as the repayment terms go. But the biggest thing that we're looking at when we're looking at these seller's notes and the how they are structured is that we're looking at what can the company support, on a historical and a going forward basis. And so if the cash flow is really tight, like debt service coverage ratio is something that we look at very closely. If that is very tight, like less than 1.2 times, then maybe we feel like we're going to want to see a couple of years of just interest only payments. However, if there's some wiggle room there, if the company has really strong cash flow, then we're going to be less strict and allow the repayment to be as aggressive as it can be from a pro forma debt service coverage ratio standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Thank you, Shelley. Great points. And I think, like Al said, and I'm sure you agree, Shelley, it's really important to get your banker involved early. So in my class that I teach from the buy side at Rice, it's to have a banker as you go into this, right? So they can help to look at the deal, value the deals, and everything. Because again, the last thing that you want to do on both sides of the table, buy and sell side, is get in the middle of this and start to have problems, right? So engage your banker, your equity investors if you're going to have them early in the process, so they understand and help you navigate it.
Hey Al, can I just add to that? I mean, I think just
Sure.
Get your entire deal team, right? Whether
your entire team.
Yeah, your entire team, your consultant, your banker, your lawyer, your accountant, your entire deal team, get them involved as early as possible. I think that's very important.
Yep. Yeah, great point, Greg.
I'll mention something that we do, if you don't mind, to Shelley's points. When we're putting together a listing package, including the listing agreement, we do have the seller's spouse sign off on the transaction at that stage. We have the other owners of the company sign off and actually agree on who the point person is going to be for signing documents. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't talk to each other and, you know, come to an agreement before that person signs off, but we do like to have real clarity and authority in the process.
Yeah. Peggy, I'm going to come to you next, and I'm sure sitting there in the catbird seat as intermediary, seeing both sides. I know you've seen it all. We've shared a lot of crazy stories and just you know, this whole process. But again, what are some of the common challenges that you see and the advice that you'd have for sellers?
Yeah, as to the question of why businesses don't sell, I think that it's often the result of the business owner starting way too late in the process. They really need to be working on the business. As they, you know, the E-Myth Revisited is a book that was written decades ago, and it talks about really treating your business as separate from yourself. And Shelley mentioned, you know, sometimes the owner is overly involved. Well, there are situations where if the owner were to be disabled or to pass away, a business literally has almost no value. Even if it's a fairly large business, it can be almost devastating. That may be worth, you know, liquidating asset value. And I just recently talked to an owner who's 83 years old, and he was involved in every single client, large transaction, and no one was really being delegated to. And so, you know, hopefully in most cases, we want to start as soon as possible. Just well, Exit Advisors is all about preparing a business for exit, and it can be many years later. And that's how we work also. 3 to 5 years is very common. And what we do, you know, an owner may say to me, well, I'm not interested in selling my company right now. And I'm like, I want to talk to you about selling it 5 years from now or more. You don't, you know, it's really about preparation, and the sooner the better. I think that one of the things.
Peggy, can I just, I'm sorry, but I just have to kind of say some things about this point because I think it's such a good one. You know, I've seen customers in which they have a wonderful, beautiful business, and then the owner who is too involved in the business unexpectedly passes away. And what happens, what I've seen happen, unfortunately, multiple times, is that that business then gets passed on to the children. Nobody knows what the owner was doing, and the business goes under and the assets are liquidated. And that's why the business never sells. And it is so sad because the business was such a beautiful thing. And if there was just more delegation, if that owner would have been talking to someone, an advisor, you know, ahead and really thinking ahead, that wouldn't have happened and the business wouldn't have been dissolved.
Yeah. And I've even said to business owners, take more vacations and don't take your cell phone. Don't run the company remotely. That is so important.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Can I add something else just quick? And I think the same goes for the risking of many other things in addition to the dependency on the seller. I think every company that I saw, for the most part, had opportunities where the seller could have increased and enhanced the value by removing risks, like unsteady revenue, right? Turn revenue into recurring. Even, for example, with the company that we bought, it turns out the sellers didn't get the customers on recurring contracts because they saw them as a sure, return customer, and they rather kept them without a contract so they could increase the value. But for us, it was a no-brainer to get them on a contract and get that to be recurring. If they had done that, they would have gotten a better valuation for sure. And things like that, some of them really low-hanging fruit. And so, yeah, I always saw many of those opportunities in most companies, if not all.
Yes, where they don't step back and look at the business model. And that's why using someone like Exit Advisors, and I'm not trying to promote Exit Advisors, but the whole idea of using someone to help you model the company in such a way that you do have recurring revenues. And the reason that's important is the multiple for the recurring revenue portion of the business is going to be higher. Sometimes we'll have a hybrid multiple, and the multiple on non-recurring business is definitely lower than that for recurring business. But one thing I did want to mention is that, and again, I'm not promoting my own business because I really am here to serve, but I do think that self-representation through the sale of your business is a huge mistake. And I say that because many business owners, they have unrealistic expectations about value, but they also have unrealistic expectations about how the financing needs to be structured. And they may say to me, I only want cash. I'm not going to carry a note. And that may not be at all realistic. And if they're saying that to a buyer, they're going to run off that buyer really fast. So they really need someone to help temper their expectations and help them to be flexible where they need to be flexible. And also, some of them, they've raised this business up from a baby. And so they are overly sensitive about that baby. And they need someone to help them to, just step back. And the intermediary is going to negotiate these points. And I don't pass on things that I don't say to the seller, the buyer said your baby is ugly. I will find a way to communicate to the seller the information that is actually needed to help through the negotiation process. But sometimes buyers will say the baby is ugly, thinking they're going to get a lower price. And so it's important to have an intermediary in that process so that it will move forward. They also know how to facilitate a transaction. They know the different experts and advisors that are needed in the process, an M&A attorney, who are the good lenders, who are the lenders who can get the deal done, et cetera.
Anything else, Peggy, that you've seen? Any war stories out there, or some of the big challenges that you've seen, or something that really stands out in your mind?
Yeah, I think the one that really does stand out is this issue of client concentration. I'm working on a project right now where they have, 5 million in business and they have 2 clients. And in this situation, it's a required sale because there's a divorce in process and the judge is requiring that we sell the company. So we don't have a long lead time to correct a client concentration problem, which could take potentially a couple of years or more. And so in this situation, we're going to structure this as an earnout.
Yep.
But that's very risky for a seller. And so I'm going to have to try to find ways, we may try to use a very small employee group inside of the company to acquire it because they will feel less risk around the client concentration issue. But client concentration is a very big deal because of the risk to the buyer. They lose one client in that situation and, it's going to wipe out the value of the company. So it's very important that the base be diversified, in several different ways, sometimes across different industries, sometimes just literally across the names of the clients. So that would be, a big point. That's the one thing that blows up deals a lot. They can lose a client in the middle of a transaction. And if it's a significant client, it can raise such red flags and scare the buyer so much that they, leave the table.
Yeah.
Yep,
I think
I've seen that on a concentration on the supplier side as well. This was about 6 or 7 years ago, and this was about a $35 million company, and their one single supplier was out of Japan, and they would not sign an agreement to support a new purchaser. So basically, the owner of this company was stuck. I mean, they just really couldn't sell it as a result of that. So that concentration of credit risk can go both directions too.
Yeah. And I think what you guys are really tapping into here, that's that whole why despair value, right? So companies, again, the same industry, same size. If you have customer concentration, completely different valuation, right? If you have recurring revenue, completely different valuation. Supplier risk, completely different valuation, right? All this stuff impacts a value tremendously. And that's why there's no such thing as an average, right? An average valuation, because these things impact it, really drastically.
And sometimes,
Al, this is where you talk about getting hit by the bus. And this is the importance of having time to plan and execute properly and basically mitigate some of these risks to where a company will get maximum value.
Right. Yeah.
And type of advisor, I will say that numerous times I hear, my CPA told me that multiple is 3. And I'll be thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, we're digging out of a hole from the very beginning. And so it's like, Gary is an expert in M&A and he's a CPA. So in his case, he's not going to just pull a number out of his hat and say, oh, your multiples, blah, blah.
Yeah, but
It can really be, that hole can be quite deep.
And not to be overly repetitive, but and this just to summarize that in the way that I see it as far as valuation, that multiple that might be in line with with the industry, that's the starting point. But then every risk that's there that is not mitigated reduces a little bit and a little bit more, and so that's also ties into the conversation about what can a seller do, remove those risks to get that premium.
Al, when we actually do a valuation, certified valuation, we literally start kind of in the industry, because some industries might have a valuation multiple average of 2, some may be 4, some may be 5. Software as a service is a lot higher, and we move it left and right of average depending on those risk factors that you talked about. And sometimes it'll tick way back where it's below average, and other times, like again, I talked about Dave Linda, who'll be coming on next town hall. His was way above average because he removed all those risks. He didn't have them. He spent a month traveling as we were going through this process. He didn't have to be involved in the business. So it's great. Hey, Gary, I want to end it with you, and then we'll open it up for questions. But financial due diligence, right? Talk about that and the challenges of that.
Well, I mean, Al, as well as I do, on both sides of the fence, and same with Peggy, as the first thing that a potential purchaser is going to do is pick on financial information, right? And they're going to have somebody on the other side of the fence who's going to be going in with a microscope and looking at the financial data. So first and foremost, you got to have clean financial information. And typically you need that restated on the accrual basis of accounting, because that's just kind of the standard when it comes to a buy-sell transaction. And with that as well, you need to look at add backs. So add backs are normalization adjustments, and those are adjustments for possible personal expenses being run through the company, one-time adjustments, things of that nature, to come down to the computation of EBITDA. And so this process, and plus you possibly look to get a good valuation, 5 years of financial information. And, obviously a purchaser wants to see an upward trend, and they want to see sustainability. So, you go in, and if a buyer does a quality of earnings analysis, I mean, they want to see sustainability of possibly working capital, revenues, and net free cash flow. And so you really got to make sure that you dot your I's and cross your T's. And, Al and I have been into due diligence before. We're like structures. I mean, you have some CPAs out there and attorneys that set up these really, really elaborate structures, for possibly to minimize taxes. But then you get into a transaction, and all of a sudden those structures become a little bit too complex. And we even had representatives of PwC in Germany look at one of these structures and go, "What? what do you mean?" And so, going all the way on the accounting due diligence, the entity structure, accrual basis of accounting. Also, something that should be paid attention to is if you see you're 2 or 3 years out, and I know audits are not cheap, but neither are reviews. But I gotta tell you, if you go through that process and you have audited or reviewed numbers, I believe it'll help your multiple. I think it'll help the value of your business, because the purchaser is going to look at this and say, all right, an independent source has looked at this and they've rendered an opinion. So that is always going to be helpful. Also, basically the seller CPA should be involved in this transaction from the get-go. They probably have more knowledge of the financial inner workings of that business than anyone, even sometimes more so than the actual owner, because most owners are going to be visionaries, and they've relied on these financial people to help them with their numbers, their financials, their taxes, and things of that nature. So having them involved in a big way is very, very critical. I think a business owner probably should approach their CPA first and say, hey, what do you think? Another element of this is taxes. Taxes become really, really important because it doesn't matter how much you sell it for, it matters how much you keep, right? And nobody realizes because of tax withholding, normally a person's largest expense each year, even more so than their mortgage, is their tax liability. Because most people look at that as, well, how much did you pay in taxes last year? Oh, I had to pay an extra 200 with my return. Well, they may have paid $500,000 in taxes. But in a transaction, you got an asset allocation that you got to focus on, and you got to look at the tax ramifications. So obviously you sell your assets and it's all goodwill, it's capital gains. But of course the purchasers they want assets to be allocated to 5 and 7 year property, which could create ordinary income for the seller. So looking at the taxes from the get-go and putting together a tax plan for the transaction, I think is critical. And lastly, just to dovetail into what's going on politically right now, nobody is sure if capital gains is going to be abolished or what's going to happen, but it certainly could have an impact on selling your business. Now, another thing to consider in 2021 is if you sell your business, you may want to think about go ahead and recognizing the earnout, if it can be computable, and the seller's note, and pay capital gains in 2021 instead of risking going over to 2022 and possibly having to pay a higher rate of taxes. And this is something, of course, we're just going to have to watch. Nobody wants to pay more taxes up front. I mean, that's just not what we do, but it could over a period of time be a benefit. So.
Great points, Gary. Andrew, I think
Yeah,
we've heard a good perspective.
We've
Open
got
up to
some questions coming in, and we had some submitted beforehand. So I'm going to start with kind of in a sequential order of the way they came in. And I think this first one's going to be great for Greg and maybe Al, but it is, what's the most effective way to build an exit into your operating agreement when taking on minority partners? And I'll just kick that off with, we've had clients that have had virtually nothing, and you have to kind of create a bilateral agreement in real time, and it's sloppy and messy, versus we have another client, as an example, that has a buy-sell agreement in place where they have a predetermined formula and algorithm for valuing that might be separate from the way we do it or a buyer does it. And it defines when and how and the timing of that payout. But Greg, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think every business owner should, when they start the business or they really see the business starting to get legs, they have to start thinking about the end or the exit. And that means, you can always go back. You start a business, most companies, you have an entrepreneur, they start a business, they'll have a simple LLC operating agreement, but the business grows and they may bring on other partners or other investors. At any time in the maturity of your business, you can go back and scrub or go back and amend or go back and change your operating agreement or corporate governance documents to meet kind of the age of the business or the maturity of the business. You're not stuck to what you did when you created the business. Just like a child, right? There are different things you do for that child as they grow. Your business is the same way. So as the business grows, as things change, you may need to adjust your corporate governance documents, whether that's your shareholders buy-sell agreement or your operating agreement for an LLC. And it's probably good, every now and then to go back and do that as you add partners, as you add investors to accommodate those new people you're adding to the business. You always have that flexibility.
I'd like to add to that too, Andrew, just real quick, just to go from the very beginning. When you set up a business and you have multiple owners, you need to consult someone like Greg. You need to get your company agreement or operating agreement straight from the get-go with tag along, drag along rights, all the elements that you got to consider in selling your business. And I unfortunately get to see some of the divorces that come through here of business partners and the mess of the operating agreements. And it's really critical that you do that properly.
Great. I've got kind of two questions here about seller's notes. What's kind of the ideal number? And then another question about earnouts and the risk and how they should be structured. So since they're both kind of tail end pieces to the valuation and the payout, I'm going to tie those together. But question is, what should the ideal earnout percentage or seller note percentage be? And I think we've seen that in all ends of the spectrum. Coming out of COVID, they were higher. Pre-COVID, they were lower. What's the best way to structure these? Al, how about you?
Well, I think Shelley probably has good insight into that. I think sometimes they're a requirement, and I think a lot of sellers and business owners don't realize that behind the buyer is somebody that's going to finance this. So it's kind of like you can go out and look to buy whatever house you want to buy, but if you're not going to qualify for the financing, you're not going to get it. You're at the terms of your financiers. So most of our small business transactions, certainly under $5 million, probably are going to involve some type of SBA or bank financing. So, Shelley, what are you? Any advice that you can give on seller notes, or I think most importantly, expectations?
Sure. So starting with the seller's note, typically we see around 20-25%. That's norm, the standard, I would say. We have done seller's note as little as 5%. And a lot of that is determined based on the buyer and the buyer's profile, along with the cash flow that we kind of talked about, the cash flow analysis that we do on the company. As far as the earnouts go, I think something really important to keep in mind is while the earnout is a great tool for risk mitigation from a buyer perspective and a bank perspective, SBA does not allow earnouts. So if you're going to be structuring an earnout, keep that in mind, because it might not, if your buyer is looking to do SBA financing, it's just not going to work. But in earnouts we can typically see in a wide variety of ranges. And if I'm doing a conventional note for the acquisition, one that's not SBA, I'm definitely going to value an earnout. And like I said, typically we see those in the 20% range, but it just depends on all the other factors that go around with that deal and that opportunity.
Hey, Shelley, one thing that I get a lot, I reviewed in the LOI yesterday from one of my former students. Can you talk about the SBA requirements on the 2-year deferred payment? Some of the requirements that they're going to put on that note.
Sure. So the 2-year, so there used to be a rule an older SBA rule. This was changed a couple of years ago that required for the first 2 years, the seller's note had to be subordinated. It could only be interest only for the first 2 years. That has since changed, but not all banks have changed their rules. So it depends on the bank, actually. However, if we're doing a very aggressive structure in which maybe the buyer is only coming to the table with 5 to 10% cash, we may require the seller's note to be fully subordinated for the life of the SBA loan, which could be up to 10 to 15 years. So as a seller, something that you're probably going to want to understand from prospective buyer is how much cash do you plan on putting in this deal versus my seller's note, because that does have direct implications on what your repayment on that seller's note is going to look like. The other limitations on the seller's note that could impact your repayment structure will once again just be, what does the company's cash flow look like? What can the company support when we look at EBITDA plus those seller discretionary earnings?
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a seller from a seller point of view, one thing that was attractive to our sellers was to defer the revenue, their income for later as well. So it was a good situation because it was a win-win. As far as the earnout, I don't know, Al, like you told me if this is just my opinion or would you consider this to be true? But to me, earnout tends to be problematic. And to me, personally, at least, is last recourse. Like my ideal percentage of earnout is 0%. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it depends.
It bridges the gap sometimes, right?
Returns, and it really depends on who's acquiring the company. Like if you have a small business and you're limited to growth and limited expansion, or you're happy making whatever you're taking home, and you don't want to put more in the business, and you have a young buyer come in there backed by private equity that's going to put the gas down and really try to grow this business. We just had a client that we had he took 20% earnout back about 8 or 9 years ago, and he sold his company for about $12 million and held back about 20%. That company just sold for $50 million. So he got his earnout was about the equivalent to what he sold the company for. So you've got to look. It's dependent, right? If someone's trying to hobble together a deal and they're trying to say, well, I'll give you some equity back in it, then you've got to take a look at that. But some of these private equity backed deals, professional management, they're going to grow and expand, complementary sales. Man, it can be and you have to put your money somewhere else. So you're going to put it in the bank and earn 1 or 2%. You're going to take risk above that. If you can have it in a company that and you might be on the board or an advisor to, and you certainly know it, and they've got upstate. You have to evaluate each one case dependent. I mean, you really have to.
Yeah. I'm very dependent on the situation with the sellers, right? Where sometimes I see the issue, right? Because now the seller's payout depends on the new manager of the company, and that's what needs to be careful about, right? But yeah, no, I agree. It's case by case basis.
Weigh the risk, the pros and the cons about it, right?
Well, I want to be mindful of time. We have a few questions that we didn't get to, but in these instances, I really do encourage everyone our doors are open, and I encourage you to reach out to us, reach out to anyone on the panel today, and we will cover them. Some of them, even more specific than just general what ifs. But really enjoyed having everybody. Thank you to Peggy and Shelley, Greg and Al. Gary and Al, the whole gang, but thank you for your time today and for your expertise, and thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.